There are many problems with Dark Elves, from their penchant for trying to own people, to the fact that in the stories in which they originally appear, they basically don't exist. The thing is, Svartalfheim, as described in the Prose Edda, is specified as the home of the Black Elves. Yet it is populated exclusively, as far as we can tell, by dwarfs. But this is confused again by references in the same document to Dark Elves, who live underground and have dark skin, as opposed to Light Elves, who live in the heavens and are beautiful. So are the Dark Elves really just dwarfs? There's a lot of confusion over this point. Or are they an addition to these oral traditions included in the 13th century by Snorri to represent the changing tide towards Christianity, towards a world which perceived angels and demons as part of the cosmic order? Whatever your interpretation, and however you resolve that dwarfs and elves seem basically the same in their Scandinavian origins, it is definitely true that Dark Elves have historically been especially poorly defined. And yet, across multiple fantasy properties, Dark Elves are among the most popular species. But on the whole, these Dark Elves are not particularly interesting. Now this will probably sound like sacrilege. After all, you probably love one of D&D's Drow, Warhammer's Druchii, or the Elder Scrolls' Dunmer. Not this guy, though. You probably don't like this guy. But hear me out. Every single one of these is a society of long-lived yet distant and arrogant creatures, with a culture of slaving, living in a formidable and challenging environment, led by dark magic-wielding charismatic leaders who tend to overstate their power and their godliness. This description encompasses all of the Dark Elves from the properties I just mentioned, whether they're led by the tribunal of pretender gods, or Lolth, a demon-come-goddess, or Malekith, who failed the test to become the Phoenix King of the Elves. We're not getting into any of the in-law reasons why he might have actually failed that test. That is beyond the scope of this video. The fact remains, he is not accepted as the universal elven leader. Each group of Dark Elves is shown as being led by outcasts, the imperfect, or, in worst case, pretenders. Dark Elf culture is never dominant in their given universes, but is always fairly strict, and almost always involves a belief that Dark Elves are superior, and therefore justified in taking slaves. All Dark Elves in modern media representations are essentially exiled settlers, creating their own version of high culture in a savage and difficult environment. The Elder Scrolls series sees the Dunmer settling in the harsh land of Vvardenfell, being forced to settle again after the Red Mountain goes boom. The descent of the Drow, involved in Forgotten Realms lore of D&D fame, sees the elven gods punishing the Dark Elves and making them vulnerable to sunlight. And then they're forced underground into the harsh Underdark by various elfin armies. And Warhammer's Druchii leave Ulthuan, settling in the cursed icy land of Nagaroth, right next to the Chaos Wastes. The best historical analogue we have for these types of cultures are settlers from the old world, striking into new, dangerous lands, all the while using slave labour to tame those wilds, while seeking to retain some of the cultural practices, social order, and home comforts from the old world, all the while not necessarily seeking to be dominated by the systems of government of those old places that they've left behind. Essentially, they're early North American settlers. But the fact that they're similar to each other isn't the only problem facing Dark Elves in modern fantasy. Namely, these common complaints are that they're depicted as basically universally evil, and the fact that they all have deep dark or black skin, despite the fact that they live in environments, or near universally, with very, very little sun, or less sun than the surrounding areas. the cold, frozen, mountainous reaches of Nagaroth, the ash-filled skies of Vardenfell, and literally underground in the case of the Drow. Darker skin tones, in real-world biology at least, are best at protecting the bearer from ultraviolet radiation from the sun. That's the main evolutionary advantage. If we're going strictly by biology and not by culture, then Dark Elves should really be among the fairest skinned of folk, because there's not that much need for them to have a high melanin content. Unless we have a social selection for this type of skin tone. In any case, insisting on certain skin tones is bordering on an issue in itself, because we are associating often evil, malevolent, and necromancy-wielding forces with darker skin tones, which historically has some implications which are not ideal. There are people more eloquent than I, able to talk on the issues of tying certain evil and taboo moralities to skin tone. I am not exactly qualified or particularly well educated in this region. I will leave that to them, but suffice it to say, it's not a great look, which is why modern fantasy trends have been moving away from it. I will say this, personally, I'm not terribly interested in an ontologically evil group who all share similar facial or racial features. That's just not something I care too much about. So with that said, I think it's time we move from analysis of what Dark Elves generally are presented as to analysis of how they might develop into an interesting or even novel culture. So how can we take these stagnant and often overplayed elements and make them sing without losing what is at the centre of Dark Elven culture and interest among modern fantasy readership? So when we think of Dark Elves, we often think of dark magic as well. The Dunmer focus on ancestral spirit magic and sorcery. The Druchi of Warhammer use spirit summoning. And the Drow have natural capacity for certain evocation magic. From this, we can start to establish our species' core tenets. A strong capacity for less benign magic, classic elven features like longevity and an otherworldly nature, and this seemingly fairly common living situation of exiles in a hostile land, while having had some old world history. So we're not going to stray too far from what has been done before, because that is the established situation that Dark Elves find themselves in modern fantasy. We're going to have them be exiles from another land. Goodness, there's an argument that Dark Elves aren't even at home in Svartalfheim, which could conceivably be considered the home of the Dark or technically Black Elves. We just see dwarfs there. Maybe they're coexisting, but it's not exactly a land of their own. So from the very earliest sources, Dark Elves seem to be in some sort of limbo in terms of their spatial place in the cosmos. Our Dark Elves are probably going to have some sort of a history with dwarfs, therefore, seeing as they live in their home. But why would Dark Elves be exiled? Basically, I don't want to go into the Dark Elves are bad apples, barring maybe one or two exceptions looking at you, Forgotten Realms. So let's make the reason for their exile cultural, and as an outpouring of their innate nature. Tragically, because Dark Elves are not really an established force in our mythology, unlike many of the other creatures of fantasy, we don't have too much to go on. So these links may be fairly tenuous, but I hope you stick with me. Because what actually sets Dark Elves apart from elves, other than the dark bit? This dilemma, this exact dilemma, I think, is the reason why Dark Elves have really struggled to get any sort of nuance in their identities when they show up in our tales. I think what could be valuable, instead of getting caught in the thorny issue of what is dark, is looking at what might be taboo. for elfin society more generally. What rules could the Dark Elves have broken that caused them to be exiled from the main elven corpus? Traditional necromancy is probably not viewed that badly in elfin society compared to others, largely because elves tend to be used to having lesser beings do menial tasks for them. So if you're not interfering with elven souls and just, reanimating some bones every so often, fine by them. I think the two biggest taboos in elfin magic would be something that ends the life specifically of an elf, as with their shockingly long or potentially immortal lives, depending on interpretation, the end of an elven life, untimely end, would be shocking and tragic indeed. If that person's immortal and they've been killed, well, that is against nature, surely. I would also suggest that magic which binds specific creatures to a particular place, plane, or form may be a massive elfin taboo as well. Elves are changeable, ethereal beings with links to realms far beyond, and to trap a creature in a single form or place for its immortal life, of its soul, might be the ultimate taboo. Perhaps those who practice binding magic may find themselves more bound to a certain place of existence as well. Perhaps if our Dark Elves are users of this kind of magic, our innate kind of talents at this sort of magic, their spirits and bodies begin getting tied closer and closer to a material reality than their ethereal jaunts of their cousins and neighbours. Because maybe practicing binding magic ties you in with the things and the places and the world in which you are actively using it, begins to bind you as well, making you less elf-like, less flitting, less otherworldly. This might force our Dark Elves, and we are getting to the naming situation at the end of the video, so just stick around for that. But it might force them to care more about material affairs, the affairs and physical realities of the world in which they live. They may be more worldly than their ethereal elven peers. After all, spirit magic is heavily tied to many of the presentations we see of Dark Elves in Warhammer, in the Elder Scrolls, for example. And making binding magic specifically a massive elfin taboo that these Dark Elves may have chosen to break for practical or other reasons could tie in with that notion that they're using some sort of dark magic, which isn't necessarily always dark. To tie in with the situation of the dwarves, who are living in the same land at the time of the 13th century prose Edda, at least that presentation of the world, we may see a collaboration of sorts emerging, where Dark Elves use their binding magic to gather elemental spirits, or spirits of nature, or simply spirits of kings or warriors long dead, to imbue them into objects which are then master forged or master crafted or included in great dwarven weapons and armours, allowing the creation of sentient artifacts or artifacts of legend. Perhaps it is the binding magic which scares elfin elites, or their collusion with the elves' despised counterparts that causes the rift. Or perhaps it's the Dark Elves' ready adoption of the deities of the mortal folk, adoption of their customs and trade. But some combination of these is likely to get our Dark Elves expelled from the world of light and etherealness and flitting that is the realm of elves. Of course, the main elves see banishment from their lovely changeable Fey realm as a punishment. But the Dark Elves who are in exile might see it as a possibility to practice and expand upon their craft, their innate power. After all, working with Fey spirits and attempting to bind those is probably notoriously difficult. But mortal spirits and elemental spirits and spirits of the world of flesh may be much, much easier to pin down. All of a sudden, we have a dark elfin culture. expelled from the main elven corpus for breaking a taboo using dark magic, which is dark in the eyes of the elves because of its deleterious effects on the freedom, changeability, and flitting nature, the ethereal nature of an elf. All of a sudden, we have a dark elven culture which uses dark magic, exiled by the elves for breaking taboos, which also uses its innate gifts to capture and bind slaves to their side, but in a way that doesn't hark back to kind of uncomfortable real-world realities. So the main difference between our traditional elven isolates and our dark elves here is that they are more of the world. They're likely to be more involved in collaboration and trade, largely due to the utility of their magic, the ability to capture essences from spirits and utilize them for their own gain. But being closer to other species isn't always ideal, because it both removes mystique and breeds resentment. While traditional elves may be seen by the mortals as ethereal, otherworldly and mysterious, dark elves, due to their proximity, even if they act the exact same, may be distrusted and treated more like people than as otherworldly entities. Their relative immortality may lead to a fairly common perception among the mortal races that a dark elf that befriends you or works with you is just staying around long enough so that they can wait for you to die, so they can then steal your soul and keep it for themselves in their little bag of trinkets. After all, they just want to collect a series of spirits that can actually exist on the same time frame as them, the immortal span of years, not just the flash in a pan that your mortal life is. They're going to keep you forever if they really like you. And that might be a terrifying prospect to anyone who believes in an afterlife. It may also lead to perceptions that they get along with unchanging, eternal, immortal spirits that they keep in little gems or trinkets or dream catchers better than they get along with actual mortals with a limited time on this world. So this must be enough, then, to create a culture of dark elves that is distinct from the traditional fantasy fare, does something a little different, potentially. Not yet. The Elder Scrolls Morrowind is often held up as the gold standard for environmental design in games, because of its uncompromisingly strange aesthetic vision, mixed in with a focus on culture, faith, and environment. The Dunmer speak with gravelly voices and tend to be shorter for words than average because of the ash-choked lands of Vardenfell. The three great Dunmer houses are separated largely by geography. It influences their living standards and their traded goods. And the dark elf worship of the tribunal, these three pretender gods, is largely facilitated by Vardenfell's relative isolation from the rest of Cyrodiil and from the Daedric princes and the other gods that are within that space, as well as these three specific deities of the tribunal being specifically and materially involved in helping out the dark elves in dark times. The gods that make up the tribunal have found a way through for dark elven society through the environmental challenges of their environment. This is all to say that Michael Kirkbride's vision, shared by the team that created Morrowind, of a strange land filled with strange things, like cities made of mushrooms and of giant crab shell. All of this land and the built environment around it shapes the civilization of dark elves massively. When I build things on this channel, I try to keep environment as general as possible. Largely because I want people to be able to fairly easily steal my ideas and put them into their own stuff. And specifically, make my ideas much cooler by importing them onto cool environments that they've already conceived, or that might shift that specific cultural expectation that I've set up just slightly. So I'm not going to use environment as a resource here, despite the fact that the Elder Scrolls is a pretty masterful example of doing exactly that. However, what I am going to try and do is give you some rapid-fire cultural and religious consequences that may spring up from the version of Dark Elves that we have set up today. Dark Elves may make excellent nomads. They have no reason to store ancestors' bodies or special trinkets in a specific place, a graveyard that they need to keep coming back to every so often. Their ancestors are stored with them in trinkets and crystals and all things like that because of their bound souls. They can travel fairly light and still have access to the great tapestry of their own cultures. This may also make them opposed to faiths or cosmologies that suggest that there is an afterlife. Dark Elf theology may assume that creatures that die may simply be souls leaving bodies and staying on this world, flitting from place to place as restless or vengeful spirits. They could easily become mediums, exorcists, or make a living trading or selling guardian spirits off to people as protector ghosts. Alternatively, they could be factions who pine for the old days, the old civilization of the elves that they have been exiled from, the time when they were changeable, magical, faced creatures of otherworldly presence and able to flit between worlds. It may be that some sort of a cultural system develops among these old world or Renaissance Dark Elves of transferring into new social roles every so often, every few decades, to ensure that their life is not stale, that they feel that rush of being something else every so often. Perhaps learning a new trade or trying a new craft or being in a different profession every few decades makes Dark Elves, at least these kinds of Dark Elves, prodigious polymaths, and might have the added benefit of keeping these specific kinds of Dark Elven society really quite progressive, with a constant churning of who's in charge, who's building what, which ideas get to be in place, or which ideas get to be tried out eventually. Things are in a constant roiling state of flux, which might help with one of the key criticisms of elfin existence on a material basis, which is, well, their culture may well stagnate if they live for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. These specific old world hopefuls of Dark Elves may well judge wisdom and experience of another elf or another creature by how long and storied and varied their CV is. When it comes to Dark Elven worship, we may see shapes and geometries playing a large part in this specific social religious order. Objects to Dark Elves don't just represent a place or a time or a fond memory. They are often imbued, in our world then, with spirits. Specifically, potentially spirits of their ancestors. Laying out the specific objects representing your ancestors in a tapestry, a scene that makes an intuitive sense or moves towards a specific conclusion or asks for different aspects of these individuals, may be among the most affirming rituals a Dark Elf can undergo. It might also make a form of individual personhood, as opposed to individual. Dark Elves may be comprised of all of the different parts of the ancestral spirits that they keep on them in their closest necklaces, in their small bangles or earrings. This may be some sort of active arranged ritual family tree or star chart linking different ancestors to different historical events. And this could grant a Dark Elf power or the ability to commune with their ancestral spirits. And perhaps there's some sects of Dark Elves that don't just seek to master the binding of spirits to objects, but seek to remove the middleman, to bind spirits to their own form, literally embodying or channeling spirits, either ancestral or the spirits of other creatures that they have collected. From ancestors to dryads, perhaps enabling them to act as spirit mediums or channelers. I also believe that the Dark Elves' potential connection with dwarves could yield a bit more than just some enchanted weapons. Dwarven clan culture may actually adapt to include Dark Elf close friends or allies because of the similarities among both groups in their relative longevity and also in their hatred for the other elves and their unchanging nature as well. The unchanging nature of dwarfs and the unchanging nature of these dark elves who practice binding magic and therefore have bound themselves to a place. Dark elves may also integrate into many societies as scouts or rangers. I am fully aware of Drizzt Do'Urden, but that doesn't change the reality that dark elves, specifically drow or dark elves in D&D, are nearly perfectly suited to being some sort of scout or ranger or wilderness survivalist. They're long lived enough to learn a land, noting long-term changes and environmental pressures. They're long-limbed enough to be able to run at great speeds and with some significant endurance. And oftentimes they have dark skin, either for the purpose of blending in at night or for making sure that the ultraviolet rays from the sun are not going to damage them over their long lives. Dark elves could very easily fit into a semi-nomadic caste of hunters and scouts and rangers that exist around the outskirts of a civilization. They have generations worth of knowledge around the lands they serve, and each successful hunt gives them another spirit to add to their collection, another spirit that they can then channel in future hunts. The strength of a bear, the dexterity of an eagle. We may also see some forms of dark elf society creating their own taboos around their own innate magical powers to better blend in with other societies. Perhaps the binding of sapient spirits is made illegal in some dark elf societies. You have to prove that the spirit is not in any way a thinking being, because thinking beings tend to believe in afterlives, and that's caused some issues in the past with overzealous dark elves stealing your ancestors from their rightful place in Valhalla. Perhaps these prohibitions even extend to the dark elves' own ancestors, and certain sects or societies might choose to release or break the spirit stones that hold their ancestors to better assimilate into other mortal societies who believe in afterlives. These breakaways or sectarians may be considered as traitors by the traditionalists among dark elven society, though, as they have betrayed their own ancestors by refusing to take upon the mantle of keeping them around. Or perhaps they have simply abandoned their ancestors to ghostly torment. And if we take D&D lore that banshees are the spirits, the distressed spirits of dead female elves, they may have a point that elfin spirits and souls should best be kept stored by dark elf binding magic, lest they become a problem and roam the world restlessly, causing some massive issues. But to the fundamental question, why are they called dark elves at all, in a diegetic, in-world sense? Now, there could be many reasons. Perhaps they're just dark, in opposition to the celestial, glowing, ethereal elves, who have a glowing complexion. The dark elves no such glow. Or perhaps their mode of magic, akin to voodoo, soul trapping, or soul snaring, is considered in some way dark magic, and therefore they're dark elves. Maybe it's just considered that by the other elves, and that name has stuck. Perhaps their historic assimilation and association with dwarves means that dark elves may be widely considered as living in the same tunnels, living deep underground in areas of darkness. And so dark elves as opposed to light elves walking through the woods and ethereal jaunts into the Fey realm. Or perhaps it's the threat to mortals of making a dark elf your friend, only for them to not age while you reach your final breath, and hoping against hope that they won't just take your soul. Or maybe you want them to take your soul and keep you with them. But maybe that is a dark practice, maybe that is a dark magic or some way taboo, to bind yourself forever to a soul trinket. Or maybe it's because one sect of dark elves may try to be present at as many deaths as possible. to give the deceased a chance to let their soul be bound and vouchsafed and kept safe as part of the collective of collected souls and spirits, able to be communed on, called upon, and be useful to the generation of culture in years to come. They're not pushy, but maybe like evangelical Christians, they want to give everyone a chance to repent or make a different decision just before they die. Perhaps it's the hoods that they wear, perhaps it's the intensity of their faith and belief that the afterlife is a pointless, silly dream. Or perhaps it's their uncanny, unerring ability to show up, unannounced, just in time to try to save the soon-to-be deceased. Perhaps people will be suspicious or refuse help from a Dark Elf Samaritan as a matter of course, not wanting to invite that closeness to death into their home. Or maybe this sect gets a reputation for being of some comfort to the sick and the lonely at the very end of their lives, appearing out of nothingness, out of the forest, just to spend the dying moments of a creature's life with them. No obligation, of course, but maybe that's a small comfort to those suffering in wilderness. Who knows? Such a sect may even invent the hospice. But there's just some thoughts. Just some thoughts about what we could do with the Dark Elf template that could be more interesting, or more novel, or less, to use the word, problematic than some of the other fantasy presentations of Dark Elves. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've found something in this discussion inspirational or interesting. And if you haven't, kudos to you for sitting through the video. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the thegrungeonmaster. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.